I am honored to introduce my friend and esteemed colleague, Professor Kathryn Freeman, an exceptionally accomplished scholar, teacher, and colleague at the University of Miami. She earned all of her degrees at Yale and is an internationally renowned scholar, especially in the fields of British Romanticism, Orientalism, Blake studies, and women's literature. As anyone who knows Professor Freeman knows very well, she also happens to be an exceptionally kind and compassionate person. Her four books thus far include Blake's Nostos, Fragmentation and Non-Dualism in the Four Zoas, British Women Writers and the Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1785 to 1835, Reorienting Anglo-India, A Guide to the Cosmology of William Blake, and the exciting new book she will present tonight, Rethinking the Romantic Era, Androgynous Subjectivity and the Recreative in the Writings of Mary Robinson, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Mary Shelley. I want to just make a side note briefly about her third book, A Guide to the Cosmology of William Blake. It was first published in 2017, then it was selected for the online Romanticism program in 2018, and then it was published in paperback in 2019, which is very fast. So this series of events shows how incredibly important and impactful Professor Freeman's Guide to the Cosmology of William Blake has been. Not surprisingly, Professor Freeman is very busy. She is hard at work on 3 additional research projects, another scholarly book, Through the Lens of Phoebe Gibbs, Gender Entitlement and Anti-Romance in the Long 18th Century, an edition, Phoebe Gibbs' 1786 novels, Zoraida or Village Annals, and Elfrida or Paternal Ambition, and an essay, Perdita, Ophelia, and the Shrine of Walsingham, Mary Robinson's Reimagining of Gender, Sexuality, and British Literary History. It's no wonder that Professor Freeman has been granted funding for her research on a competitive basis 8 times while at UM. Without further delay, let's hear what Professor Freeman has to say about her fascinating new book, Rethinking the Romantic Era. Please join me in giving Professor Freeman a hearty virtual welcome.
Thank you so much. Am I muted? No. So thank you all for being here. It's great to see everybody. Thank you, Pam, for that very generous introduction, and to the Humanities Center for hosting this, Hugh, and everyone on the staff who's been so helpful to me, and also to the Humanities Center for having granted me a fellowship several years ago when I was starting this project, and giving me the opportunity to work with colleagues across different disciplines who created a very engaging environment to begin this process. I want to thank my colleagues and both people working now and emeritus professors. I'm happy to see some of you I haven't seen in a while, and former graduate students, and everybody, my sisters especially, who I miss sorely. We haven't seen each other since before the pandemic, and it's always bittersweet to see you guys on Zoom. And Jory, my son, who is at home. I came into the office because I'm worried about Wi-Fi, so it's very odd to see you on Zoom, but it's also wonderful to see you. So anyway, thank you all. Before I begin, I want to dedicate this talk tonight to the memory of Fred Berwick, an amazing scholar who died a week ago, a day after he published his last novel. He was an incredible intellectual, prolific writer, and a friend to so many people who will miss him greatly. So I thought one way I would try to frame this project is by telling you about an article that came out in 2020. And I actually started my graduate seminar this semester with it because it came out about the time this book was in production. And it's an article by a professor named James Chandler, who teaches at University of Chicago. He's been there for many years. And he's also for many years been the general editor of the Cambridge Romanticism series. And the article he wrote is called Revisiting Romantic Canonicity. And it was ostensibly, the word ostensibly is key there, a celebration of the career of Jerome McGann. Some of you may be familiar with as a very important scholar, not just in Romanticism, but I think in the whole course of the way literature, the field of literary study has evolved. And he challenged the idea of a sort of monolithic romantic group of writers at this very early phase of the recovery of many writers, particularly women who had been well respected, well regarded in their own right. So I begin with that by to point out that I am probably of that school of people who would challenge the idea of a central romantic canon. And by the way, in James Chandler's article, he says that even though he welcomes studies of gender and race and imperialism, he says it would really have to be romanticism and gender romanticism and race romanticism and imperialism. In other words, he doesn't want to get rid of that. And my point is that it is a disservice to not only to those writers who we consider non-canonical, but I think it's also a huge disservice to a writer like Coleridge to only be seen in relationship to, say, Wordsworth, which is the most common way he's seen. So in my book, I created a triangular relationship among Coleridge, Mary Robinson, who some people I know are familiar with, but others may not be. So I can say more about her during the question and answer. I don't want to spend a lot of time in terms of biography, except to say that she was extremely well regarded in her time. She was a poet, a playwright, a novelist, a polemical prose writer, and an actress who played leading roles in over 30 Shakespeare plays during her lifetime. And so that relationship was very important. And by the way, she was the elder poet. And when people do write about elder poet between herself and Coleridge, when people talk about their relationship, they often will use, well, one person used the word avuncular to describe Coleridge's attitude towards her, which is really unfortunate because avuncular, of course, like an uncle, he was the younger poet and she was the elder one. So it shows the kind of prejudice going into it that the sort of ideology of Romanticism has created. And then, of course, the third, what is it, Jory, the vortex in the triangle, is that what it's called? I can't remember. Anyway, is Mary Shelley, who everyone is familiar with Frankenstein to some degree or another, but you may not be familiar with some of her other novels. I talk about a novella she wrote the year after Frankenstein called Matilda, which, trigger alert, is about suicide, rape, and incest. So when I get to it, this is fair warning there. And also I talk about her novel Last Man, which is set in a little bit after our time with the plague. It's considered to be the first dystopian novel. And so everything it sort of coalesces in that last chapter. And I'll say more about that. So when I was thinking about the structure of the novel, I decided to do something very idiosyncratic. And when I sent the book out to publishers, one reviewer made a comment that actually it was very helpful to me. And I added sort of footnote about just because it wasn't clear, which is he said, if you're trying to sort of even the balance, why are you spending so much time talking about Coleridge? And I realized it was important to say that because what I have is a chapter on Coleridge, his relationship to Wordsworth, his relationship to associationist philosophy, and then a chapter on Coleridge and Robinson, and then another chapter on Coleridge in terms of his later writings, and I'll say more about that. And then the chapter on the three of them together. So anyway, this person asked why I'm spending so much time talking about Coleridge. And my answer to him, and what I explained in the book, is that there's 200 years plus of discussion of Coleridge, which is very complex because there are two camps of Coleridge criticism in general. People either talk about the poetry or his prose, so they see him either as a philosopher or as a poet. And to me, I think you can't really separate them. I think there are ways in which it's all very important, but I need to be able to talk about that first, and then look at the relationship with Robinson and then with Mary Shelley. So I want to share my screen. Oh, this wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, here we are. Okay, so before we start, I want to show you the book cover. My sister Jane, who is here, painted this image, and I was very grateful to Bloomsbury for allowing me to use it, because to me it was a perfect representation of what the book is about. And I think that'll become clear in the course of my presentation tonight. So I'll come back to it. Well, yeah, I'll say more about it at that point. What I'd like to do before I get to some of these passages is to read you just the beginning of the introduction to see how I frame the argument. So I begin. A male tale-teller who ostensibly sets out to redeem his auditor instead spreads contamination. For Mary Robinson, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Mary Shelley, this meta-narrative device holds the tale-teller's moral sickening of his auditor in tension with the didactic message their readers have traditionally demanded from the poems and novels that contain the tales. In each case, the facile closure of a moral lesson fails according to what Kant refers to as the categorical imperative binding morality to systematic binaries. Such dualism undergirds British moral philosophy that in turn fuels the expectation of moral closure by late 18th and early 19th century British readers. The tale-teller's narrative thus fails, whether he is disingenuous about his promise of redemption or lacks insight about the nature of tale-telling in the worlds these three writers recreate from the vestiges of the binary systems they variously dismantle. So I go on in the introduction right after that to talk about my use of the word non-dualism, to talk about the commonality among these writers. And it's a word that I use in some of my earlier writings as well, because I think it's central to the revolt behind this revolutionary period. It's a revolt against the binary structures of Enlightenment thinking and the poetics of a lot of the, I think, masculinist writing surrounding Coleridge, who wrote famously, people quote this a lot, a great mind must be androgynous. And so what that means, I think, becomes very important to this. And I can say, again, more about that later. But I'd like to, oh my mouse, where did it go? Here it is. Go back to this slide. Let me see if I can minimize this. Yeah, here. So this is a late work of Coleridge's. And as I said, the poetry and the prose really speak to each other in Coleridge's corpus of literature. Biographia Literaria, My Life in Literature, is really very important as a forerunner to what we think of as modern literary criticism, because he's putting the entire evolution up to his time of Western philosophy in relationship to his ideas of what poetry should be. And it took him all of these years to write it, because he was so much at odds with Wordsworth in their writing together of the lyrical ballads, which Wordsworth really sort of took over from Coleridge and essentially wrote out a lot of Coleridge's poems because he was uncomfortable with them for reasons that I can say more about. So at the heart of Biographia Literaria, after he's gone through the sort of discussion of materialist philosophy, associationism, which is so important to Wordsworth's poetry because of memory. It's founded on the association of ideas through memory. Coleridge, and by the way, once he gets to German Romantic philosophy, which he was so influenced by when he took a trip to Germany, and everything shifted at that point for him. But it wasn't the end point. And this is where a lot of people stop with Coleridge's sort of epistemology, because he plagiarized a lot of the German philosophy, Kant and Schlegel. And he didn't deny that he plagiarized, but he does something also, and I'm not apologizing for him for plagiarizing. He did a lot of things that people were sort of always slapping him on the wrist, even his biographers early on and so on. I can say more about that later. But he attributes ideas that are original with him to fictional characters. So I say that's the opposite of plagiarism, right? Because he is creating things, but saying they were given to him by other people. And in this case, his definition of imagination, and there's nothing like it before or after, he says was given to him by a very judicious friend. And of course, it's himself that gave him this idea. So just to get to this, he divides imagination into two levels: primary imagination and secondary imagination. I put in bold faces some of the words that are important as I go through it. Secondary, by the way, isn't lower than, it's built on primary imagination. So he says, primary imagination I hold to be the living power and prime agent of all human perception, and as a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. And I want to just pause there for a moment and talk about, of course, the biblical I am is the ultimate subjectivity, which is common to all beings. So it's the repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation. And it's Coleridge, who was very fond of etymologies. He was self-taught as a child. He taught himself Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. And so he probably would have been very aware of the etymology of the word religion, linking back ligio as ligament, right? Linking back to the eternal. And by the way, the word yoga has the same meaning of linking the limited with the absolute self. And so that's common to all, but he says secondary imagination is only reserved for artists. And he says, and this is where things are extremely important for the divergence of Coleridge and Wordsworth and most of his other contemporaries. He says that secondary imagination dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates in order to recreate. So it's a very revolutionary, faculty in its disruptiveness, in its violence. But it does this to recreate. And then it's very poignant that he has this second clause, or where this process is rendered impossible, yet still at all events it struggles to idealize and to unify. And he's really speaking of himself there, because he always felt like a failure for not being able to do that, which of course, looking back at this from the hindsight of postmodernism, we can see how very much this kind of fragmentation looks ahead to much later writing. But the key to him, for Coleridge, is that it's essentially vital, even as all objects are essentially fixed and dead. So that's not the end of it, though. The last paragraph is the most damning for Wordsworth and for many of his contemporaries. And just to remember that he was extremely influenced by associationist philosophy in his early years. He even named his son Hartley after David Hartley, one of the great associationist philosophers. But here, by 1817, he is finally saying this, bringing all of this to the surface. He says, fancy, on the contrary. And by the way, I think he was probably, maybe some of you can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think he was probably the first person to differentiate between imagination and fancy, because I know a lot of his contemporaries use them interchangeably. So he's seeing this as a lower faculty. and saying that it is indeed no other than a mode of memory emancipated from the order of time and space, and which basically describes Wordsworth's poetry, the spots of time and so on, while it is blended with and modified by that empirical phenomenon of the will, which we express by the word choice, but equally with the ordinary memory that fancy must receive all its materials ready-made from the law of association. And there, nobody in his time would mistake this idea of associationism as being demoted in the hierarchy of mental faculties. So I want to go back then to this early poem of his, very early, 1795, which is known as the Aeolian Harp. It was, he called it originally, the title was Effusion 35. He had many poems that were called effusions. And the Aeolian Harp is an important image in the poem. That's why people call it that. It's a central metaphor. Some of you may be familiar with Aeolian harps. In fact, if you Google Aeolian Harp, you would find what looks like the body of a stringed instrument that would be put in the casement of a window. It's a little bit like when we have wind chimes now, they had Aeolian harps, and the wind would play the instrument and it sounded very eerie. So people actually still make them. And I've seen even online some public sculptures of Aeolian harps, very eerie sounding. So in this poem, just very quickly, he begins, again, it's known as a honeymoon poem. He's with his new bride, Sarah Fricker, and it's not looking promising for this marriage. And indeed it wasn't, because she is sort of looking pensive away from him and he's trying to pull her in and not being very successful. And he goes on this flight of imagination. And at the heart of it, he says, and what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all. And so, several points are interesting here. First of all, it's very pantheistic. And as soon as he says this, he immediately has her say, I see you look at me with that mild reproof, oh, chaste woman, daughter of Christ, and so on. And he apologizes for being such a degenerate man, and he will walk humbly and so on. But he, obviously keeps this. So, but if you think about it, it's fascinating because he's imagining a universe plastic and vast, and it's the idea of a plastic, a flexible, a movable universe, as opposed to that Newtonian fixed geometric universe. It really looks ahead of its time. Intellectual breeze, the word intellectual meant spiritual at the time. And so one intellectual breeze, again, that pantheistic spirit that blows through all things. So I call your attention to it because even at that very early stage, he was pushing away from associationism, even as he was using it. So for instance, he hears the Aeolian harp and it triggers this, not memory, but something different. I want to, this is still part of what's chapter 1 in the book, and I want to give you an example of what it is that he is up against, I think, with Wordsworth. And the irony of that relationship with Wordsworth is that he created the Wordsworth who we think of as the poet of description and reflection and associationism. And so, he's rebelling against that side of himself as well as Wordsworth. But there's more to it than that, I think. And it has to do with the way both of them perceive the natural world, the world of phenomena. And so here, this poem is called Nutting, 1798. And not often anthologized, so people may not be familiar with it, but it's about a childhood memory going to pick hazelnuts at the age of about 10, so prepubescent. He's very fascinated by that time, just on the brink of manhood. And indeed, the poem sort of mirrors that because it starts out innocent enough. He's like this little kid going off with his bag that he's going to put the nuts in and his shepherd's crook. And suddenly the language changes. And I want to read this to you. He says, forcing my way I came to one dear nook unvisited, a virgin scene. A little while I stood breathing with such suppression of the heart, then up I rose, I'm skipping some, and dragged to earth both branch and bough with crash and merciless ravage, and the shady nook of hazels and the green and mossy bower, deformed and sullied, patiently gave up their quiet being. So, you know, here he is in this pristine part of nature, and he suddenly just goes berserk and starts tearing it to pieces. And following this, he says, you know, I hope that I felt what I'm thinking I felt, which was remorse, but I have a feeling I'm just projecting it as an adult. So he's very much aware of the brutality of this and of what that means. But I want to think about it in terms of just jumping way ahead to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Some of you know the commonality between Victor Frankenstein and as the narrator of his tale, but also Walton, the seafarer who is narrating Victor Frankenstein's story. And they both say at one point or another that they were pursuing nature to her hiding places. And their language becomes very aggressive at certain points in the way they portray nature. And so again, I'll say more about that later. But I'd like to compare that to a very different poem by Coleridge called Kubla Khan, which people are much more familiar with. It's one of those most canonical of poems. And there's so much to say about it. And again, I can come back and say more later, but I want to talk about the way the subjectivity changes in its three central stanzas. And again, it has a very interesting textual history written in different stages and circulated among friends earlier. So Mary Robinson had read it, and we're going to look at her response to it in a minute. But he begins with Kubla Khan himself, the emperor who finds this pristine place in nature and builds a pleasure dome, a tribute to himself in this untamed place in nature. And even though these are caverns measureless to man, the sacred river Alph runs there down to a sunless sea. He starts out this, you know, mapping and measuring twice 5 miles of fertile ground. Walls and towers were girdled round all the languages of taming nature, creating gardens, the blossom, the many incense-bearing trees, and enfolding sunny spots of greenery. But then in the second stanza, something very dramatic changes. But oh, that deep romantic chasm which slanted down the green hill athwart a cedar and cover, a savage place as holy and enchanted as ever beneath a waning moon was haunted by woman wailing for her demon lover. And from this chasm with ceaseless turmoil seething, as if this earth in fast thick pants were breathing, a mighty fountain momently was forced, amid whose swift half-intermitted burst, huge fragments vaulted like rebounding hail, or chaffy grain beneath the thresher's flail, and mid these dancing rocks at once and ever, it flung up momently the sacred river. And I'm going to read a little bit more in a moment, but I just want to talk about this subjectivity of nature, because this is also a feminine nature, but it couldn't be more different from the passive virginal nature of Wordsworth's Nutting. This is a very erotic nature that is powerful and violent and paradoxical. She is savage and holy, paradoxically, and she is like a woman wailing for her demon lover. And you know, the earth in fast thick pants is breathing. This is some kind of a natural disaster, a cataclysmic event like an earthquake or something like that. And it just takes Kubla's incredible creation and just blows it to smithereens, and but doesn't just destroy it. This is where the secondary imagination can be seen very early. Remember, that was 1817. This is 1798, where he says that, I'm going to go on with that, that stanza, the shadow of the dome of pleasure floated midway on the waves, where was heard the mingled measure from the fountain and the caves. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. So she has taken Kubla's pleasure dome and made it her own. She has made it this paradoxical recreative art with her caves of ice. Now, there's one more stanza to Kubla Khan, and it's extremely important because that's where the I, the subject, comes in. And it's, again, very different from a Wordsworthian subject. By the way, I come back many times to Kubla Khan in the course of the book, in relationship first to Wordsworth and then to Mary Robinson and then Mary Shelley, all three of them. So he says, a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw, it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Abora. Could I revive within me her symphony and song, to such a deep delight would win me, that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. So it's important to see that if you were only seeing him as a canonical male poet, you would think that he was saying he wants to be like Kubla Khan and be this great creator, but he's not saying that. He wants to be like that natural power that is disruptive and paradoxical. I want to build that dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. And if I were to do that, and it's all conditional, right? Could I revive within me her symphony and song? He says, all should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. And there's a kind of androgyny, I think, in that image as well. He's both masculine and feminine, but he's also demonic and blessed, because, you know, one would weave a circle around him thrice as sort of a possessed figure. Close your eyes with holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fed and drunk the milk of paradise. So I, at one point, go on to talk about Robinson's reference to Kubla Khan in her poem to the poet Coleridge, written in 1797, so actually the year before it was published. So she had seen it. And we know this because she alludes directly to it and several other poems of his. And I want to point out how companionable she is as a fellow poet to him, that she walks beside him and validates his sense of poetic self, which is so important. So she says, spirit divine, with thee I'll trace imagination's boundless space. With thee beneath thy sunny dome, I'll listen to the minstrel's lay, hymning the gradual close of day. In caves of ice, enchanted Rome, where on the glittering entrance plays this moonbeam with its silvery rays. She goes on from there. I want to just jump to the last stanza of the poem, where she refers to that damsel with the dulcimer from the third stanza of Kubla Khan. And she says, and now with lofty tones inviting thy nymph, her dulcimer swift smiting. So now the damsel isn't just strumming the dulcimer, she's smiting it, she's hitting it. So she has all that power of nature in the second stanza. Shall wake me in ecstatic measures. And ecstatic is always an important word because of the etymology, standing outside of oneself, that she has moved to this kind of non-dual state, and proving the witcheries of song. And she ends, the damsel, sings of thee, O favored child of minstrelsy, sublimely wild. And that word sublime is also extremely important. Come back and talk about that later too. Of thee whose soul can feel the tone, which gives to airy dreams a magic all thy own. And again, there is that sort of affirmation. This is your poetry, especially because Kubla Khan is really a poem about poetic failure. I mean, there's a sense in which he says, if only I could do that. And she's saying, you're doing it. I mean, this is the poetry. She gets it about what he's doing. So I have several slides, which I'm going to skip for now, but I can come back to, about from Christabel and Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because they are so important to the book. But what I'd like to do, actually, I'm going to put the cover back up, because I think you're going to see how my sister Jane's painting is so representative of what happens. I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump to the last chapter, and then we can come back if people have questions, but this is where everything sort of coalesces. And I call the chapter The Plague of Storytelling, and it's where, I can't remember if I mentioned before that, I don't think I did, that Mary Robinson wrote a novel called Walsingham, and I know some of you know that novel well. Others of you may be less familiar with it. In it, she has the protagonist, the eponymous protagonist, Walsingham, is not a mouthpiece for her by any means. My argument is that she uses him in a very ironic way to talk about this masculinist kind of monolithic way of living his life and moving through his sense of reality. And he is misguided in many, many ways. And the central way he's misguided, and if anyone's planning to read the book, this is a spoiler, so I'm going to let you mute me if you don't want to hear the spoiler. But one of the many ways he is misled is, and we are misled, we don't know until the end of the novel, that his rival, whose name is Sir Sidney, his cousin, he believes wrongly, he's been jealous of him his whole life for reasons that are complicated and I can mention later. People have questions. But he believes that he has wooed and defiled the woman that he loves. So there's a love triangle, he believes, there, and he resents him and he threatens a duel and so on. But by the end of the novel, and this is where you can mute me, he discovers that Sir Sidney is actually a woman who has been cross-dressing her entire life. So there is this, most profoundly androgynous figure at the heart of that novel, and giving the lie to Walsingham's belief in the way things are. And it overturns the whole sentimental tradition in ways that are important also to the book. So I talk about that quite a bit, and then I turn to Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, a lot about Frankenstein and the relationship to Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is alluded to directly. Both Walton and Frankenstein talk about having an albatross around their neck. So, and it's interesting to note that Mary Shelley had heard Coleridge read Rime of the Ancient Mariner when she was a little girl, because of course her parents were literary celebrities, Mary Wollstonecraft, excuse me, who wrote the first, essentially what became feminism, the first treatise on feminism and vindication of the rights of women, and William Godwin, author of many important works of social philosophy and novels like Caleb Williams. So anyway, I want to, I'm going to skip some of this, and actually I'm going to go right to the last couple of paragraphs of the chapter, which was originally the end of the book. And so I start by saying, through the lens of Frankenstein, the last man. Oh, and I want to say something also about the last man, which is Mary Shelley having, the last man is the narrator of this. And of course, he is, as the title suggests, the last survivor of this plague. So the last man dismantles and recreates the earlier novel, Frankenstein's earlier novels universe. The fate of the last man, Lionel Verney, is an ironic realization of the most hopeful future the creature of Frankenstein could imagine, namely the utopian life that the creature had promised Frankenstein he and his companion would live apart from a society that abhorred him. Without a companion and ultimately without Victor to hate, the creature chooses to immolate himself in a final scene that Walton, as the framing tale-teller, will record. Lionel alone has the story of the plague to tell, but no one to hear it. Rather than submerge the feminine as she does in Frankenstein, whose women are silenced, whose female nature is violated, and whose female creation is destroyed by her creator in a grotesque parody of the recreative act, Shelley represents the force that brings down patriarchal history in The Last Man as the plague gendered female. The plague is most overtly identified as such, with Lionel's bitter reflection of, quote, those times when men walked the earth fearless before plague had become queen of the world. In so personifying the plague, Shelley pays homage to Coleridge's Life and Death, and I can say more about that if people aren't familiar with it, from Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Life and death condemns the mariner to the endless spread of a tale that destabilizes the pieties of categorical imperatives. By the end of The Last Man, Shelley has collapsed even the implicit binary of tale-teller and auditor, Coleridge's mariner and wedding guest. Though stunned like the wedding guest at the end of Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Lionel, unlike the mariner, is cursed to tell his tale to no one. So, as I said, that was the original ending of the book, but my editor asked me if I would include a coda, and I was surprised at how easily that came because I'll read it to you. I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs in the middle because it goes into a tangent that I don't need to go into right now. But I started by saying Mary Shelley's 21st century plague in The Last Man is only a half century later than the COVID-19 pandemic. A new generation that attempts to find footing in the uncanny narrative of a contaminated planet may find cold comfort in a return not only to this first dystopian novel, but also to that triangular literary fellowship among Coleridge, Robinson, and Shelley that produced tale-tellers and other unreliable subjectivities, spreading disease even while promising catharsis. As levels of contamination become mutually infectious, the line between the metaphorical and literal becomes untraceable. Contaminating narratives within text gesture to literary influence as metatextual influenza. One might trace the origin of this disease to Coleridge's beautiful leprous Life and Death, who may well be the progenitor of the mutated gene that wins the soul of the mariner, who in turn spawns infectious tale-tellers and their recreators. Thus, for instance, Robinson's Walsingham compels another mariner. This is the part I'm going to skip because it goes into, I can come back to it if anyone's curious. But I will talk about, by the way, in Walsingham, Robinson gives Walsingham many embedded poems, which are hers that she published separately, but in the context of the novel, take on a very different meaning. And one of them is called The Exile. So in Walsingham's poem, the masculinity of his exile persona is underscored from the first line where he stands on, quote, a rock of dreadful height, cast out of his home and community in favor of what he thinks is his masculine rival, Sir Sidney. While Walsingham, that's the part I'm going to skip, sorry. Let's see, in The Exile, set against Walsingham's masculine persona atop a high peak, the feminine is transfigured to a landscape of cataracts, yawning gulfs, and a predatory she-wolf prowling nearby. As Robinson's novel Walsingham thus unfolds, gender is at the heart of Walsingham's sublimated disease. Under the surface of his narrative, his poetry tells us that his is not the ostensible story of male antagonists vying for the love of a woman, but one that has dismantled the gender binaries of the sentimental novel. Like Walsingham's androgynous cousins, Sidney, and Coleridge's dismantled, reassembled sentimental heroines, Life and Death and Christabel, Victor Frankenstein's creature is uncanny in his grotesque beauty. And this is maybe where my sister's painting really captures that idea. The female companion of Victor's creation, in turn, is a more diseased embodiment of Victor's contaminating and disfiguring recreative urges. Odious to Victor from her partial creation to dismemberment, she is a grotesque parody of Percy Shelley's feminine ideal, the epipsyche, which means soul out of my soul. And he has a poem, Percy Shelley, called Epipsychidion. Whereas Mary Shelley dares to imagine the end of human history, this is my last paragraph, in The Last Man, with one last tale-teller writing for no one, our pandemic offers us the opportunity to discover our own voice, the authorial, behind the multiplying subjectivities demanding priority that crowd our collective imagination. The nature of the uncanny, unheimlich, may ease our global anxiety. Returning home, however, temporarily, we forge new or renewed awareness of our own authorial home to which we may continue returning, perhaps sadder and wiser, from tales of woe in a perpetual process of recreation. Thank you.
Thank you. And if maybe you could end the share screen and we'll switch it back to gallery view and we can turn to the questions.
Okay, here we are.
So I'll just say a couple words about asking questions. Probably there is one in the chat that you can look at, Kathy, and
okay.
but there's people, I think, will ask to unmute and ask questions in person. And probably the easiest thing to do is to go to reactions, hover at the bottom, go to reactions. And at the bottom of that, there's a raise hand function, and that'll move you to the upper left-hand side of the screen and make it easy to see. You can also just keep your hand, but there's enough people, there's a couple of screens that you might be missed.
Okay, hi Anna, it's so great to know that you're here. I see your question in chat. Let's see. What is your personal opinion on rhyme poetry versus free verse versus prose in terms of being an agent of making the images and ideas memorable and thus portable? That is the on the overlap of the roles of poetry and associated layers of imagery. Interesting question. So the choices of writers of poetry, free verse, which was anyone writing free verse? I don't know. And prose. And again, I think, you know, if you think about Mary Shelley writing fiction as opposed to poetry, she really, in her 1831 introduction to Frankenstein, to the revisions of it that she published, she really belittles herself as a prose writer. She says she scribbled as a child. Women were seen as scribbling, or if they were writing poetry, they gushed. And so I think that prose had always been seen as the bottom of the hierarchy, but clearly now as the field has evolved, that has changed very dramatically with, you know, not only novels and polemical prose, but also memoirs, diaries, notebooks becoming, and journals becoming important. So I don't know, I hope that answers your question. I don't know if there were others, but thank you for asking that.
Frank has his hand raised.
Oh, okay, Frank. Hi, Frank, it's great to see you. You're muted, is that something I do? Yeah, can you?
Frank will have to.
I will repeat, thank you, Kathy, very much.
Oh, thank you.
Also. And that was great. That really helps to draw together, to provide the reasoning behind your drawing together these three figures. I really like what you say about Walsingham. And I've been thinking about Coleridge, but I've been thinking about more the philosophical Coleridge. So I don't know if what we're working on exactly intersects, but it's very interesting to rethink Coleridge, I think, and especially to pay attention to those writings of the 1790s. And, you know, I've been reading Biographia Literaria for a long time, and it's never quite gelled for me in the way that it did when you said, well, you know, the reason why he had a lot of trouble with getting this down is because he had a lot of trouble. But yeah. I guess that my question will be, and I've also become much more sympathetic to Coleridge's statements on poetics as opposed to Wordsworth's, you know, since that's the way that they were originally taught to me. But I wonder if you could say a little bit about one of the words in your title, which I think you might have alluded to, but maybe you could expand on, and that is the word recreative. Oh, yeah.
And that comes out of Biographia Literaria. And by the way, before I answer that, I just wanted to say that Biographia Literaria was, of course, criticized, not only for the plagiarisms in it, but because it was so incoherent. And I think the most famous comment about it was by Leslie Stephen, who is Virginia Woolf's father. He said it was put together with a pitchfork, which kind of funny. But yeah, the recreative, that's central to the book. And again, I take it from secondary imagination, because it's the idea of pulling things apart and putting them back together, that it's not, because it was already revolutionary enough just to talk about creativity, that human beings could be creative. Like we talk about creative writing now and don't think anything of it. But at that time in the late 18th century, to talk about human beings creating, only God created, you know, in the Enlightenment, idea that, Wordsworth talks in the prelude about the child imbibing through the mother a sort of creative spirit, and he, creates the world around him. That's very important. And Coleridge is going a step beyond to talk about the recreative. And so that's the way I'm using it and talking about all of these writers doing that.
Right. It's about, yeah. So it's as much about the moment of destruction that you're emphasizing in Nutting as it is about the attempts to put it back together.
Except, I would say that you never see anything of that kind of sexualizing of nature in that kind of aggressive way from the point of view of a persona, a male persona. And I think he's always much more aligned with the feminine or the androgynous. That's my sense. Yeah.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Thanks.
There's another question in the chat from my neighbor, Ronan.
Steve. Oh, hi, Steve. Good to see you. I think I see you. Besides Coleridge's addictions exacerbating perhaps his worst tendencies, can you expand a little bit on the split between Coleridge and Wordsworth? Yes, I can. I can expand a lot. It's very complex because Wordsworth has a poem, maybe people are familiar with, called Resolution and Independence, in which I think most people read that as being critical of Coleridge, but also seeing part of himself. I think they saw parts of themselves in each other that they really didn't like. And so Resolution and Independence is really about being irresolute and dependent and worrying about, on Wordsworth's part, how, he says, how can he who, asks others to build for him, do all these things for him, think that it's okay? And people have always read that about Coleridge. So a lot of it is just, irritability with a person who, as you said, became needy on a lot of levels, but also he was getting a little too chummy with Dorothy, his sister, William Wordsworth's sister, and he was very uncomfortable about that, the relationship between Dorothy Wordsworth and Coleridge. And even if it wasn't that there was something going on romantically between them, I think that Dorothy really responded to Coleridge's Christabel, which is a poem I really wish I had had time to talk about because it's so interesting. It's a poem which is deeply disturbing, and Coleridge wrote it in two parts. The second part, it's very incoherent, as most of his works are. The second part was written after his trip to Germany, and it goes back, instead of going forward, it goes back and rewrites the same thing from a different point of view. And but it's about a beautiful young woman who goes out of her father's this patriarchal man. Her father's name is Sir Leoline. I mean, nothing could be more patriarchal than that name, Leoline. And her mother died giving birth to her, and she the mother says that at midnight, the stroke of midnight, her bridegroom will appear. And so she goes out there every night hoping that this man is going to come. And instead of a man coming, it's a woman who comes, and her name is Geraldine, which is a very androgynous name. And she's beautiful, like she couldn't be more beautiful. And she says that she was essentially kidnapped, and suggests raped by these men. And please help me, she says. So Christabel picks her up and brings her into the house. And that carrying her over the threshold, people have often read that that she's a witch, because a witch couldn't cross the threshold by herself. She had to be carried in. But there's this moment, the narrator is one of those unreliable narrators who is very kind of prudish. I mean, he says, oh, what was going on in that room between those two? I can't say what it is, but it's a sight to dream of, not to tell. And whether that dream is a nightmare or a sexual fantasy isn't completely clear. But anyway, so you can see why Wordsworth, who never goes into any of that in his poetry, would find that very uncomfortable. But Dorothy loved that poem. And so anyway, that's just part of a long story that I could probably spend more time on. Steve, I don't know if that answers your question. And you said, what do you mean by worst? Where did I say word? Anna said that about Steve's comment, his worst tendencies. Well, okay, let me say something about that, Anna, because that's an interesting question. So The definitive biography of Coleridge for years was by someone named Norman Freeman, who wrote, the biography was called The Damaged Archangel. And even that title really suggests the way people looked at him, that he would have been one of the archangels, you know, the great poets, but he was damaged. And, you know, his plagiarisms, his opium addiction, his laziness, all of these, you know, ways he would flagellate himself. And so, yes, I mean, I would question that too, because the biography that supplanted Norman Freeman's is written by Richard Holmes, and it's a fantastic biography. It's in a couple of, I'm just looking at the chat, sorry. Yeah, what was I saying? Anyway, it's Richard Holmes's biography really looks at him in a much more, I think, even-handed way, and change the way people look at him. So, yeah, but I see what you mean, Steve. Okay, any other questions?
Well, if we'll just a bit more.
Thank you, Mokta. What's that?
I said, well, wait just a bit more, but
okay.
if not, we're about at 9.
Okay.
So I'm not seeing anything. I guess I will just wrap by saying, first of all, to everybody who's appeared virtually tonight, thanks for coming. And I hope you'll come to other book talks that we give. We have more this year, and to our other events. But above all, I want to thank Kathy for a great talk on what looks like a really interesting book, and congratulations on having published it.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Great to see everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, okay, so are we signing off?
Yeah, feel free to sign off anytime.